hillside and the kite. Hello, and welcome to the Midnight Archive. Imagine, if you will, a hillside in Tuscany on an afternoon in late April, the year 1452. The olive trees are silver green, their leaves turning gently in a warm breeze that carries with it the scent of wild thyme and freshly turned earth. Below the hill, the vineyards descend in careful terraces toward the floor of the Arno Valley, their young vines just beginning to push pale tendrils toward the sun. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rings. Not urgently, not calling anyone to prayer, but simply marking the passage of another hour in a world where time moves no faster than the shadow of a cypress tree crossing a stone wall. And in a small house in the hamlet of Anciano, just outside the town of Vinci, a child is born who will one day see farther, think deeper, and observe more closely than perhaps any human being who has ever lived. His name will be Leonardo. He will have no surname in the way we understand it. He will simply be Leonardo from Vinci, Leonardo da Vinci, a name that 5 centuries from now will still be spoken with a kind of reverent wonder, as though the words themselves contain a secret. But tonight, we are not interested in the legend. Tonight, we are interested in the man, the actual, living, breathing man who walked on real roads, who ate real bread, who stained his fingers with real ink, and who lay awake on real nights wondering about the nature of light and the movement of water. We are going to walk beside him, slowly, quietly, from the Tuscan hills of his childhood to the soft French countryside where he would close his eyes for the last time. And we are going to take our time. There is no hurry. There never is, here at the Midnight Archive. So, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. The screens, the notifications, the endless rush. Let it all dissolve like morning mist over a river. We are traveling back more than 500 years to a time when the world was lit by candles and the sky at night was so full of stars that a man could lie on his back in a meadow and feel the whole universe pressing gently down upon him. This is the story of Leonardo da Vinci, and it begins, as all stories do, with a place. Before we begin this journey through the life of Leonardo da Vinci, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'm always curious where in the world you're watching from tonight, so leave a comment and let me know. The town of Vinci sits in the lower valley of the Arno River, about 20 miles west of Florence, nestled among the hills of Montalbano. In the 15th century, it was a small, quiet place, not a city, not even truly a town by Florentine standards, but rather a cluster of stone houses gathered around a modest church and a castle tower belonging to the Guidi counts. The roads were unpaved, dusty in summer and muddy in winter, and they wound between fields of grain and rows of olive trees whose trunks had been gnarled by decades of wind and sun into shapes that looked almost human. The air smelled of rosemary and wood smoke, and in the spring, of the wild irises that bloomed purple and white along the edges of the terraced fields. This was not the Italy of grand palaces and marble colonnades. This was rural Tuscany, a world of peasant farmers, small landowners, and local notaries who kept the records of births, deaths, marriages, and property sales in heavy leather-bound books. It was a world where the rhythms of life were set by the seasons. The pruning of the vines in late winter, the planting of grain in spring, the olive harvest in November when the air turned cold and the hillsides smelled of crushed fruit and damp earth. People rose with the sun and went to bed not long after it set because candles were expensive and the darkness outside the walls of a house was absolute. Into this world, on the 15th of April, a Saturday, Leonardo was born. His grandfather, Antonio da Vinci, recorded the event in his notebook with the meticulousness of a man accustomed to keeping records. He noted the hour, the 3rd hour of the night, which by the old Florentine reckoning meant roughly 10 o'clock in the evening. He noted the name of the priest who baptized the child the following day. He even noted the names of the 10 godparents who attended the baptism, a number that suggests the family, despite the circumstances, considered this birth worth celebrating. And the circumstances were, by the standards of the day, somewhat awkward. Leonardo's father, Ser Piero da Vinci, was a young notary of 25, ambitious, well-connected, already beginning to build the career that would eventually make him one of the most successful notaries in Florence. His mother, Caterina, was a young woman of the village, almost certainly of peasant origin, possibly the daughter of a woodcutter or a farmer. They were not married. They would never marry. Within a year of Leonardo's birth, Ser Piero would take a wife of his own social standing, a young woman named Albiera Amadori, and Caterina would be married off to a local man, a lime burner and kiln worker named Antonio di Piero Butti, known as Acatabriga, a nickname that roughly translates as one who seeks a quarrel. Leonardo, the child of this brief union, would grow up between two households, spending his earliest years, it seems, partly with his mother and partly with his father's. The precise arrangements are lost to history, as such things often are when they concern children born outside of marriage. What we know is that he was not entirely abandoned and not entirely embraced. He occupied that particular painful middle space that illegitimate children have occupied in countless societies across countless centuries. Loved, perhaps, but not quite belonging. Acknowledged, but set slightly apart. There is a particular kind of solitude that comes from growing up in a household where one's presence is both accepted and slightly unexplained, where the adults speak carefully around certain subjects, where a child senses, without anyone telling him directly, that his story has a wrinkle in it that other children's stories do not. We cannot know with certainty what Leonardo felt about his birth. He rarely mentioned his mother in his surviving writings, and when he did, it was with a brevity that might suggest either indifference or a pain too deep for elaboration. But we can observe the shape that his life took, a life of extraordinary independence, of few permanent attachments, of a man who seemed always slightly outside whatever world he inhabited, watching it with the eyes of someone who has learned, very early, to be an observer rather than a participant. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. For now, the child is small, and the world around him is vast and full of wonders that have nothing to do with the complications of adult life. Imagine him, a boy of 4 or 5, walking along a dirt path with his uncle Francesco, who was barely more than a boy himself, only 15 or 16 years older than his nephew. Francesco was not a notary like Ser Piero. He was a man of the countryside, a farmer who loved the land and the unhurried pace of rural life. And in the absence of a father who was increasingly occupied with his career in Florence, it was Francesco who became Leonardo's companion in those early years. Together they walked the hills. Together they watched the seasons turn. And it was in this quiet companionship, on these dusty paths between the olive groves, that Leonardo's extraordinary eyes first opened to the world. What did he see? Everything. He saw the way a lizard's tail curled when it basked on a warm stone. He saw the spiral pattern in the shell of a snail, making its slow way across a wet leaf. He saw the way water moved in the small streams that cut through the hillside after a rain, how it braided around pebbles, how it formed tiny whirlpools at the base of a fallen branch, how it caught the light and broke it into fragments of silver and gold. He saw the way a hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents that rose from the sun-warmed fields, tilting its wings with adjustments so subtle that they seemed almost imperceptible. And yet each one was precise, purposeful, calculated by some ancient intelligence that the bird carried in its very bones. These were not the observations of a typical child, or perhaps they were. Perhaps all children see the world this freshly, this intensely, and most simply learn to stop paying attention as they grow older. What made Leonardo different was not that he saw these things, but that he never stopped seeing them. The attention he gave to a snail's shell at the age of 5 was the same attention he would give to the flow of blood through a human heart at the age of 60. The thread was unbroken. The curiosity was bottomless. Years later, as an old man, Leonardo would write in one of his notebooks a strange and vivid memory from his infancy. He described how, while he lay in his cradle, a kite, a reddish-brown bird of prey common in the Tuscan skies, descended upon him and opened his mouth with its tail feathers. The bird's feathers brushed against his lips, again and again, as if trying to tell him something, or feed him something, or claim him for its own. Was this a real memory? Almost certainly not. No one remembers their own infancy with such clarity. Sigmund Freud, 4 centuries later, would write an entire essay analyzing this passage, reading it as a screen memory, a fantasy constructed later in life and projected backward onto childhood to give meaning to impulses and obsessions that the adult mind could not otherwise explain. Whether Freud's interpretation was correct is a question we need not settle tonight. What matters is that Leonardo chose to write it down among the thousands of pages of his notebooks. Pages filled with observations about the flight of birds, the flow of rivers, the mechanics of pulleys and the anatomy of horses. He took the time to record this strange, dreamlike image of a bird opening his mouth in the cradle. And it tells us something. It tells us that Leonardo himself believed, or wanted to believe, that his fascination with flight was not something he had chosen. It was something that had chosen him. It had come to him in the cradle, born on the wings of a bird descending from the wide Tuscan sky, and it had never left. The light is fading now over the hills of Vinci. The cypress trees stand like dark sentinels against a sky that has turned from gold to rose to a deep, dusky violet. Somewhere below, in one of the stone houses, a candle is being lit, and the smell of wood smoke drifts from a chimney into the cooling air. A boy is being called inside for supper. Tomorrow, he will walk the hills again, watching, always watching. But for now, the day is done, and the valley is settling into the particular silence that only the countryside knows. A silence made not of emptiness, but of 1,000 tiny sounds. The chirping of crickets, the distant bark of a dog, the soft rustle of wind through the olive leaves. And in that silence, a mind is already beginning to stir. A mind that will one day try to understand everything: the flight of birds, the movement of water, the structure of the human body, the nature of light itself. But tonight, it is simply the mind of a small boy falling asleep in a stone house on a Tuscan hillside, dreaming perhaps of a bird descending from the sky. The workshop on the Via dell'Agnolo, the Florence that Leonardo entered as a young teenager, sometime around 1466 or 1467, was a city in the full flower of its extraordinary century. It was not a large city. Perhaps 40,000 people lived within its walls, a number that would seem modest even by the standards of that era's great capitals. But what it lacked in size, it more than made up for in intensity. Florence in the second half of the 15th century was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable concentrations of human talent and ambition that the world has ever produced. Within these walls, within these narrow streets that smelled of leather and lye and baking bread, artists and thinkers were engaged in nothing less than the reinvention of how human beings see themselves and their place in the universe. But let us not approach Florence from the vantage point of history. Let us approach it from the vantage point of a boy arriving from the countryside. Imagine the walk from Vinci to Florence, perhaps 2 days on foot, or a long day by mule or cart along the road that wound through the hills and down into the Arno plain. The road would have been dusty in summer, lined with poplars whose leaves flickered silver and green in the breeze, and as the traveller descended from the hills, the landscape would have gradually shifted from the wild, terraced slopes of Montalbano to the flatter, more cultivated fields of the Arno Valley, where wheat and barley grew in neat rows, and the river itself appeared broad and brown, winding lazily toward the sea. And then, Florence. The first thing Leonardo would have seen was the dome, Brunelleschi's dome, the great terracotta cupola of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, rising above the city's skyline like a red mountain. It was the largest dome built since antiquity, completed only a few decades earlier, and it dominated the city from every approach. Its sheer scale was a statement. This is a city that dares to build what has never been built before. For a boy from a small town, the sight must have been staggering. Inside the walls, the city was a labyrinth of narrow streets, some so tight that a person could stretch out their arms and touch the buildings on both sides. The ground floors of most buildings were given over to workshops, bottei, where artisans of every kind practiced their trades. The air was thick with the sounds and smells of production. From the wool dyers' district near the river came the sharp, acrid smell of urine and alum used to fix the colours into cloth. From the tanners' quarter came the heavy, almost sweet stench of animal hides being softened and stretched. From the bakeries came the warm, yeasty fragrance of bread. And from the apothecaries came the complex, layered scents of dried herbs, ground spices, and medicinal oils stored in ceramic jars. The streets were loud. Merchants called out their wares from open shop fronts. Carts clattered over cobblestones. Donkeys brayed. Church bells rang on the quarter hour from dozens of towers, overlapping and echoing off the stone walls, until the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And everywhere there were people. Merchants in fine wool cloaks, monks in brown habits, soldiers in leather jerkins, women carrying baskets of vegetables on their heads, children running barefoot between the legs of adults, beggars sitting in doorways with their hands outstretched. For a boy who had grown up in a world of olive groves and birdsong, this sensory onslaught must have been both thrilling and overwhelming. Florence was not merely a city, it was a machine, a vast, noisy, productive machine that took in raw materials and turned out finished goods: cloth, leather, jewelry, furniture, and, most gloriously, art. It was Ser Piero, Leonardo's father, who arranged his son's apprenticeship. Whatever distance existed between them, Ser Piero recognized the boy's talent, or at least recognized that a career in art was the best option for an illegitimate son who could not, by law, enter a guild of notaries or practice as a physician or a lawyer. The guild restrictions that barred illegitimate children from the most prestigious professions were, in a bitter irony, among the forces that pushed Leonardo toward the workshop that would reveal his genius. The door that closed behind him opened another, one that led to a room full of paint and marble dust and the smell of heated bronze. The workshop he entered was that of Andrea del Verrocchio, one of the most respected and versatile artists in Florence. Verrocchio was a sculptor, a painter, a goldsmith, and an engineer, a man who could cast a bronze statue, design a tomb, paint an altarpiece, and construct a copper ball for the top of the cathedral dome, all with equal skill. His bottega occupied a building on the Via dell'Agnolo, or possibly near the Piazza di Sant'Ambrogio. The exact location has been debated by scholars. And it was, by any standard, one of the finest training grounds for young artists in all of Italy. Step inside. The workshop is a single large room on the ground floor, with high ceilings and tall windows that let in the clear Florentine light. That particular light, golden and precise, that seems to define every edge and surface with a clarity that painters have been trying to capture for centuries. The floor is stone, covered in a fine layer of dust, marble dust, plaster dust, the pale residue of ground gesso. Along the walls stand wooden shelves, holding jars of pigments. Lapis lazuli, ground to a powder as blue as a summer sky, and more expensive than gold. Terre verte, the soft green made from iron-rich clay. Lead white, dense and heavy, and faintly sweet-smelling. Vermilion, a red so vivid it seems to pulse with its own light. And ochre, in shades from pale yellow to a deep, warm brown, dug from the earth itself. In one corner, a small furnace glows with embers, used for melting bronze and heating tools. The air near it is thick and warm, carrying the metallic tang of hot metal. In another corner, blocks of marble stand waiting, their surfaces marked with charcoal lines where the sculptor has begun to plan his cuts. Wooden panels lean against the walls, some freshly gessoed and smooth as cream, others in various stages of painting. On a large work table, brushes of every size lie in rows, some made from hog bristle, stiff and coarse, used for broad strokes, others made from the fine hair of a squirrel's tail, so delicate they could render the individual threads of a spider's web. This is the world Leonardo entered, and he entered it at the bottom. A garzone, an apprentice, in a Renaissance workshop did not begin by painting. He began by serving. He swept the floors. He fetched water from the well. He ground pigments with a stone muller on a marble slab, a tedious, physically demanding task that required hours of patient, repetitive motion to reduce lumps of raw mineral into the fine, smooth powder that could be mixed with binding agents to create paint. He learned to prepare wooden panels by applying layer after layer of gesso, a mixture of animal skin glue and white chalk, sanding each coat smooth before applying the next, until the surface was as flawless as an eggshell. He learned to mix egg tempera, the traditional painting medium, combining egg yolk with ground pigment and a few drops of water to create a paint that dried quickly and had a luminous, matte finish. These tasks were not glamorous, they were not creative, but they were essential, and they taught the apprentice something that no amount of theoretical instruction could convey: the physical reality of art. Art was not an abstraction, it was a craft. It was made of real materials, stone and wood and metal and earth, and understanding those materials, feeling them in your hands, knowing their weight and texture and smell and behavior, was the foundation upon which everything else was built. Leonardo, by all evidence, was an exceptional student. He learned quickly, moved from menial tasks to more demanding ones, and soon began to be entrusted with portions of the master's own commissions, a common practice in Renaissance workshops where major works were often collaborative efforts. Verrocchio would design the composition, paint the most important figures, and assign lesser elements, a background landscape, a secondary figure, a piece of drapery, to his most capable assistant. It was during one such collaboration that something remarkable happened. Verrocchio was working on a large painting of the Baptism of Christ, an altarpiece destined for the monastery of San Salvi. The composition showed Christ standing in the Jordan River while John the Baptist poured water over his head, with two angels kneeling to the left, holding Christ's garments. Verrocchio painted most of the figures himself, in his solid, somewhat austere style, but he assigned one of the two angels, the one on the far left, to his young assistant Leonardo. The difference is visible to this day. The painting hangs in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, and anyone who stands before it can see, with startling clarity, the moment when a student surpassed his master. Verrocchio's angel is competent, well drawn, firmly modelled. Leonardo's angel is something else entirely. It seems to glow from within. The face is turned in a gentle three-quarter profile, the eyes soft and luminous, the golden curls of hair painted with a delicacy that makes them appear to move in a breeze. The skin has a translucency, a sense of light passing through flesh rather than merely bouncing off it. That was unlike anything being produced in Florence at the time. Giorgio Vasari, the great biographer of Renaissance artists, who wrote his Lives of the Artists in the following century, tells the story, possibly embellished, possibly not, that when Verrocchio saw what his apprentice had done, he was so struck by its superiority to his own work that he resolved never to touch a brush again. This is almost certainly an exaggeration. Verrocchio continued to paint, but the story, even if not literally true, captures something essential: the recognition, by a master of his craft, that the young man in his workshop possessed something that could not be taught. It could only be witnessed. And what was that something? It was not merely technical skill, though Leonardo's technique was already extraordinary. It was a way of seeing. Where Verrocchio and most of his contemporaries painted the world as a collection of solid objects with clear outlines and defined edges, Leonardo saw something different. He saw that the world was not made of outlines. It was made of light, light that flowed, that softened, that blurred the boundaries between one thing and another, that made the edge of a cheek dissolve into the shadow behind it rather than ending in a hard line. He saw, even then, the principle that he would later call sfumato, the technique of building up thin, translucent layers of paint so that forms emerged gradually, as if seen through a veil of smoke. It was a revolution, quiet and personal, happening in a workshop on a Florentine street, noticed by no one except the master who watched it unfold. And it had begun, as all revolutions do, not with a grand declaration, but with a single, small, perfect thing: an angel's face turning in the light. The streets of the Lily. To understand the man Leonardo was becoming, we must first understand the city that was shaping him. Florence in the 1470s was a city that carried a lily on its coat of arms, the red fleur-de-lis, the giglio rosso, and like a lily, it was at once beautiful, fragrant, and more complex than it first appeared. It was a republic in name, governed by a web of councils and committees, but in practice, it was ruled by a single family, the Medici, and in the 1470s, the man at the center of that family's power was Lorenzo de' Medici, known even in his own lifetime as Il Magnifico, the Magnificent. Lorenzo was not a king. He held no formal title, commanded no army, and occupied no throne. His power rested on something more subtle and, in its way, more durable: money, patronage, and the careful cultivation of loyalty. The Medici Bank, founded by his grandfather Cosimo, was one of the largest financial institutions in Europe, with branches in Rome, Venice, Bruges, and London. Its wealth flowed not only into commerce, but into art, philosophy, architecture, and the cultivation of the human mind. Under Lorenzo's patronage, Florence became what later centuries would call the cradle of the Renaissance. Though the people living through it had no such term, they simply knew that their city was alive with a kind of creative energy that seemed to touch everything it reached. Walk through Florence on a morning in 1473. The air is cool. It is early, perhaps an hour after dawn, and the sun has not yet climbed above the tile rooftops to warm the narrow streets. The light is grey-blue, filtered through a thin layer of cloud that will burn off by mid-morning. And in this gentle, diffused illumination, the city has a softness to it, as though its hard stone edges have been wrapped in gauze. The streets are already busy. A baker's boy hurries past carrying a wooden tray of fresh bread on his head, the loaves still warm, their crusts golden brown and fragrant. A woman empties a bucket of water from an upper window, and it splashes on the cobblestones below, with a sound like a handful of pebbles thrown into a pond. From somewhere nearby comes the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer, steady and unhurried, keeping time like a slow heartbeat. The Arno River slides through the center of the city, wide and brown, spanned by 4 bridges, the most famous of which, the Ponte Vecchio, is lined on both sides with the shops of butchers and tanners, their wares hanging in the open air, the smell of blood and raw hide drifting across the wall. In a few decades, the butchers will be evicted and replaced by goldsmiths. But for now, the bridge is a place of meat and leather and flies, and most Florentines cross it quickly, holding a cloth to their noses. Below the bridge, small boats move slowly upstream, their oars dipping and rising in a rhythm that has not changed in centuries. The water is not clean. The wool dyers upstream discharge their waste into it, turning its strange colors: blue, green, sometimes a murky red. But it catches the light beautifully nonetheless, breaking it into shimmering fragments that dance on the underside of the bridge's stone arches. This was Leonardo's city, and he walked its streets with a particular kind of attention that set him apart from the crowds around him. While others hurried to their workshops or their markets, Leonardo walked slowly, his eyes moving constantly, registering details that others passed without noticing. He noticed the way light fell on the face of a man stepping from shadow into sunlight, how the transition was not sudden but gradual, a cascade of subtle tonal shifts from cool darkness to warm brightness. He noticed the way a cat landed after jumping from a wall, absorbing the impact through its legs with a fluidity that suggested some deep mechanical principle. He noticed the way an old woman's hands, gnarled and spotted with age, told the story of a lifetime of work more eloquently than any words could. And he wrote it all down. Or rather, he drew it all down and annotated the drawings with his peculiar left-handed mirror script, writing that ran from right to left across the page, each letter reversed, so that the text could only be read easily by holding it up to a mirror. Why he wrote this way has been debated for centuries. Was it a deliberate code designed to keep his ideas secret? Was it simply more natural for a left-handed person writing with ink, since it prevented his hand from smearing the wet letters as it moved across the page? The most likely answer is the latter. It was practical, not mysterious. But the effect, for anyone who encounters his notebooks today, is undeniably strange and wonderful, as though the thoughts themselves had been written in a private language meant for no one but he carried a small notebook tied to his belt wherever he went. This was a habit he maintained for his entire life, and he recommended it to other artists with the fervor of a man sharing a secret that has changed his life. Always have a small notebook with you, he would later write, and with a silver point, note down the movements and postures of men as they go about their daily business, and the shapes of things that catch your eye. The notebooks he filled over the decades, eventually numbering in the thousands of pages, would become the most extraordinary private record of a human mind ever created. But in the 1470s, they were simply the working tools of a young man who could not stop looking at the world. Florence in these years was not only a city of commerce and craft, it was also a city of ideas. Under Lorenzo de' Medici's patronage, the Platonic Academy met regularly at the Medici Villa in Careggi, just outside the city walls. Here, the philosopher Marsilio Ficino translated the complete works of Plato into Latin for the first time, and led discussions that wove together ancient Greek philosophy, Christian theology, and a mystical tradition that sought to find the divine spark hidden within the natural world. The young philosopher Pico della Mirandola, brilliant, handsome, and possessed of a memory so prodigious that he could reportedly recite entire books after a single reading, argued that human beings occupied a unique position in the cosmos, unlike angels who were fixed in their perfection, and animals who were fixed in their instincts. Humans alone had the freedom to shape themselves, to rise toward the divine or sink toward the bestial, through the exercise of will and intellect. Whether Leonardo attended these gatherings is uncertain. He was not, by the standards of the Florentine intellectual elite, a learned man. He had received no formal education in Latin, the language of scholarship, and he would later describe himself, with characteristic honesty, as a man without letters, homo senza lettere. But this did not mean he was unlettered in the deeper sense. He read voraciously, taught himself Latin in middle age, and absorbed ideas from every source available to him. The Neoplatonic notion that the visible world was a reflection of deeper, hidden harmonies, that the branching of a tree echoed the branching of a river, which echoed the branching of blood vessels in the human body, which echoed some fundamental principle woven into the fabric of creation. This idea resonated deeply with everything Leonardo observed with his own eyes. He did not need Ficino to tell him that the world was interconnected. He could see it. His fellow artists were another source of stimulation and, occasionally, of rivalry. Sandro Botticelli, 5 years his senior, was already established as one of Florence's leading painters, his work characterized by flowing, sinuous lines and a dreamlike beauty that drew on classical mythology. Domenico Ghirlandaio, a meticulous craftsman, was building a reputation for large-scale frescoes that documented Florentine life with the precision of a photographer. And somewhere in the city, a boy named Michelangelo Buonarroti was growing up, 13 years younger than Leonardo, who would one day become his greatest rival. But that confrontation lay in the future. For now, the city was large enough to hold them all. Leonardo's own work in this period was ambitious, original, and, in a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his life, frequently unfinished. In 1478, he received his first major independent commission, an altarpiece for the chapel of San Bernardo in the Palazzo della Signoria, Florence's seat of government. He accepted the commission with enthusiasm. He began preparatory drawings, and then, for reasons that remain unclear, he never completed it. The commission was eventually given to another artist. 3 years later, in 1481, he received an even more important commission, an Adoration of the Magi, an altarpiece for the monastery of San Donato a Scopeto, just outside the city. He threw himself into the work with extraordinary energy. His preliminary studies show a composition of staggering complexity. A swirling crowd of figures gathered around the Virgin and Child, their faces expressing every shade of wonder, reverence, and bewilderment, set against a background of ruined classical architecture and rearing horses. The underpainting that survives, now in the Uffizi, reveals the full scope of his ambition. The figures are modeled with a depth and psychological intensity that no one in Florence had achieved before. The composition breaks every rule of the orderly, symmetrical altarpiece tradition, and yet, once again, he did not finish it. The painting remains in its state of raw brown underpainting, hauntingly beautiful, like a building whose scaffolding has been left in place, allowing us to see both the structure and the vision simultaneously. Why did he stop? The question has puzzled scholars for centuries. Some point to a practical explanation. In 1482, Leonardo left Florence for Milan, and the demands of a new life in a new city made it impossible to return to the work. Others suggest something more fundamental, that Leonardo's restless, all-encompassing mind found the act of finishing a painting less interesting than the act of beginning one. The beginning was where the possibilities were infinite, where the vision was still pure and uncompromised by the stubborn limitations of paint and wood. The ending was where those possibilities narrowed to a single fixed reality. And for a mind that saw the world as endlessly fluid, endlessly in motion, the act of fixing anything into its final form may have felt like a small kind of death. There is a particular kind of restlessness that comes from seeing more than the world around you is ready to receive. Leonardo, in these years, was already thinking thoughts that had no audience, pursuing questions that had no institutional home. He was not merely a painter. He was a painter who was also an engineer, a musician, an anatomist, a geologist, a botanist, a hydrologist, a mathematician, and a philosopher of nature. The workshops of Florence could nurture his skills as an artist, but they could not contain the full scope of his curiosity. He needed a patron who wanted not just paintings, but ideas, someone who would pay him to think as well as to paint. And so, sometime in 1482, Leonardo packed his belongings, his notebooks, his drawing instruments, his silver point styluses, his half-finished paintings, and left the city of the Lily behind. He was 30 years old. He was heading north, to Milan, to a court ruled by a duke who needed engineers as much as artists, and who might, if Leonardo played his cards right, give him the room and the resources to pursue the full range of his extraordinary mind. Florence would always be his first city. Its light, its streets, its sounds and smells had entered him at an age when such things enter the blood and never leave. But Florence was, in the end, too small for him, not in its physical dimensions, though it was indeed a small city, but in its capacity to imagine what a single human being might become. Leonardo was already becoming something that Florence's categories could not quite contain. He was becoming, though the word did not yet exist in its modern sense, a universal man. And the road north, dusty and long, wound through the Apennine foothills toward a city shrouded in fog. The court of the Moor. The Milan that Leonardo entered in the spring of 1482 was, in almost every way, the opposite of Florence. Where Florence was golden, Milan was grey. Where Florence was compact and intimate, Milan was sprawling and imposing. A city of broad streets and heavy stone buildings, and a castle, the Castello Sforzesco, that sat on the western edge of the city like a crouching beast, its massive brick walls and round towers declaring with unmistakable bluntness that this was a place ruled not by the subtle persuasion of bankers, but by the direct authority of military power. The air was different here. In Florence, the air was dry and clear, scented with cypress and warm stone. In Milan, the air was damp, heavy with moisture from the network of canals, the navigli, that threaded through the city and connected it to the rivers and lakes of the Lombard plain. In the mornings, fog rose from these canals and settled over the streets like a grey woolen blanket, softening every edge, muffling every sound, turning the city into a place of half-seen shapes and muted colours. The fog carried its own smell, a cool mineral smell, like wet stone and standing water, tinged with the faint sweetness of decaying vegetation from the marshes that surrounded the city on its northern and eastern sides. The sounds were different too. Where Florence was a city of bells and hammer-strokes and the cries of merchants, Milan was a city of hooves and wheels and military commands. The Sforza dukes maintained a large garrison, and the clatter of cavalry horses on cobblestones, the creak of supply wagons, and the distant shouts of soldiers drilling in the castle courtyard formed a constant backdrop to daily life. The Milanese dialect was heavier, broader than the Tuscan Italian Leonardo had grown up with. The vowels rounder, the consonants thicker, and mixed with it in the corridors of the court was French, the language of the Sforza family's political allies and, as it would turn out, their eventual conquerors. The man Leonardo had come to serve was Ludovico Sforza, known as Il Moro, the Moor, a nickname that probably referred to his dark complexion rather than to any ethnic origin. Ludovico was not yet officially the Duke of Milan when Leonardo arrived. He was the regent, ruling on behalf of his young nephew Gian Galeazzo, whom he had effectively sidelined. He was a man of considerable intelligence, enormous ambition, and deeply uncertain legitimacy, a combination that made him hungry for anything that might enhance his prestige. Art, architecture, engineering, spectacle. Leonardo understood this hunger, and he played to it with a letter that has become one of the most famous job applications in history. Writing to Ludovico, he listed his qualifications with a confidence that bordered on audacity. He could design portable bridges that would be useful in military campaigns. He could drain moats and build siege engines. He knew how to construct armored vehicles, catapults, and cannons of unusual design. He could design buildings, conduct water from one place to another, and create sculptures in marble, bronze, and clay. Almost as an afterthought, item number 10 on a list of 10, he mentioned that he could also paint. The letter was strategic. Leonardo understood that what Milan needed was not another painter. The city had its own accomplished artists, but an engineer, an inventor, a man who could solve practical problems, and equally important, create spectacles that would dazzle the court and impress foreign dignitaries. And Leonardo delivered. Over the next 17 years, the longest period he would ever spend in one place, he served Ludovico as painter, engineer, set designer, architect, and all-purpose creative mind. He designed costumes and stage machinery for the elaborate theatrical productions that were a staple of court entertainment. These were not simple plays. They were immersive spectacles involving mechanical planets that moved across the ceiling, artificial mountains that opened to reveal hidden scenes, and automated figures that walked and gestured through intricate choreography. The Milanese court watched with wonder as Leonardo's machines transformed their banquet hall into a universe of light and motion. The smell of the pine resin torches that illuminated these performances, the warmth of their flickering light on the faces of the audience, the collective gasp when a mechanical angel descended from the ceiling on invisible wires. These were the moments that cemented Leonardo's reputation as a man who could make the impossible real. But the project closest to his heart during these years was the Gran Cavallo, the Great Horse. Ludovico wanted a monumental bronze equestrian statue of his father, Francesco Sforza, and he wanted it to be the largest such statue ever created. Leonardo threw himself into the challenge with characteristic thoroughness. He studied horses obsessively, visiting the ducal stables to measure and draw them, recording the precise proportions of their legs, the curve of their necks, the way their muscles shifted under the skin as they moved. He filled pages of his notebooks with sketches, horses walking, galloping, rearing, standing still, each one observed with such precision that a modern veterinarian could identify the breed and the gait. The statue, as Leonardo envisioned it, would stand over 23 feet tall, an unprecedented scale that required him to invent entirely new techniques of bronze casting. He spent years working on the problem, creating a full-scale clay model that was displayed in the courtyard of the Castello Sforzesco in 1493, and that astonished everyone who saw it. The horse was magnificent, alive with a sense of contained power, its muscles tense, its head turned slightly as if it had just noticed something in the distance. But the bronze never came. In 1494, with a French invasion threatening, Ludovico diverted the 70 tons of bronze that had been set aside for the statue to the manufacture of cannons. The great horse remained forever in clay. When the French did invade 5 years later, their soldiers used it for target practice, and it gradually crumbled. It was, in the long catalogue of Leonardo's unfinished projects, perhaps the most painful, the most public proof of the gap between what his mind could conceive and what the world would allow him to complete. Yet the years in Milan also produced one of the works for which Leonardo is most remembered, and it began not with bronze, but with plaster, pigment, and silence. In 1495, Ludovico commissioned Leonardo to paint a mural on the north wall of the refectory, the dining hall, of the Dominican convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, a church that the Duke had chosen as the Sforza family's spiritual home. The subject was the Last Supper, and Leonardo approached it with a combination of intellectual ambition and technical experimentation that would produce both a masterpiece and a catastrophe. The refectory was a simple rectangular room with a high vaulted ceiling and plain whitewashed walls. The monks ate their meals here in silence, seated at long tables, while one of their number read aloud from scripture. It was a place of quietness and routine, of bread broken and prayers murmured, and the painting Leonardo created for it was designed to feel like an extension of the room itself, as though the far wall had opened to reveal, just beyond it, another table, another group of men sharing a meal, frozen in the moment of a single shattering sentence. "One of you will betray me." Leonardo did not use the traditional fresco technique, which required the painter to apply pigment to wet plaster and work quickly before it dried, a method that demanded speed and decisiveness, two qualities Leonardo conspicuously lacked. Instead, he experimented with a technique more like easel painting, applying oil and tempera to a dry wall surface that he had prepared with a special ground. This allowed him to work slowly, to revise, to build up layers, to achieve the subtle tonal gradations that were his signature. It also, as would become tragically clear within decades, meant that the paint would not bond permanently to the wall. The masterpiece was already beginning to deteriorate before its creator left Milan. But in the years of its creation, between 1495 and 1498, it was a work of such power that visitors came from across Italy simply to stand in that quiet refectory and look at it. Matteo Bandello, a novice at the convent, later recalled watching Leonardo at work. Some days, Bandello wrote, Leonardo would arrive at dawn, climb the scaffolding, and paint from sunrise to sunset without stopping, forgetting to eat or drink, his brush moving with a concentration so intense that it seemed almost like a trance. Other days, he would come at midday, stand before the painting for hours without touching it, simply looking, his arms folded, his eyes moving slowly from one face to another, studying the composition as a chess player studies a board. And then, sometimes, he would cross the city at a near run, having been struck by an idea while working on something else entirely, climb the scaffolding, add a single brushstroke to a single face, and leave. This was not the behavior of a lazy man. It was the behavior of a man for whom every mark on a surface was a decision of profound consequence. A man who understood, with agonizing clarity, the distance between the image in his mind and the image on the wall, and who would not rest until that distance had been reduced to its absolute minimum. The painting itself, even in its deteriorated state, remains one of the most psychologically complex works ever created. The 13 figures, Christ and his 12 apostles, are arranged in 4 groups of 3, their bodies and faces expressing a spectrum of emotion that ranges from shock to grief to anger to guilt to denial. Each figure is a complete character, a fully realized human being responding to the announcement of betrayal in a way that is entirely individual and entirely believable. The room behind them recedes into a perspective so precise that it seems to extend the physical space of the refectory, creating the illusion that the viewer is present at the meal, seated at the same table, breathing the same air. And at the center, Christ. His face is serene, his hands open on the table, his eyes lowered. He has just spoken the words that will set in motion the events leading to his death. And yet there is no anger in him, no accusation, only a profound and quiet sadness. The sadness of a man who knows exactly what is coming and has chosen not to resist it. The painting took 3 years to complete. By the time it was finished, the political world that had made it possible was already crumbling. The French king Charles VIII had invaded Italy in 1494, and though he had come and gone, the forces he set in motion would return. Ludovico Sforza's grip on power was weakening. The golden years of the Milanese court, the pageants, the music, the intellectual conversations, the grand projects, were drawing to a close. Leonardo, as was his nature, observed these changes with a mixture of detachment and quiet apprehension. He was not a political man. He had no interest in the rivalries of dukes and kings, but he understood, with the practical intelligence of a man who had always depended on patronage for his livelihood, that when the political winds shifted, the artist was often the first to feel the cold. In the autumn of 1499, the storm finally broke. A French army under King Louis XII swept into Milan, and Ludovico Sforza fled. Leonardo, after 17 years in the city, found himself once again without a patron, without a home, without a clear destination. He withdrew his savings from the bank, 600 florins, a substantial sum, and prepared to leave. But before he left, he must have walked one last time through the streets of the city that had been his home for nearly 2 decades, past the canals where the fog still rose on autumn mornings, past the Castello Sforzesco, now occupied by French soldiers, past the convent of Santa Maria delle Grazie, where his Last Supper already showed the first faint signs of the decay that would eventually consume it, past the courtyard where his great horse, his beautiful doomed clay horse, stood silent and exposed to the weather. He left Milan in December 1499, travelling south with his friend and fellow mathematician Luca Pacioli. The road was cold. Winter had come early to the Lombard plain, and the fields on either side of the road were grey and frozen, the bare trees standing against a low sky like the skeletons of giants. Somewhere behind him, the city he was leaving was being occupied by foreign soldiers who spoke a language he did not fully understand. Somewhere ahead of him, the future was as obscure and uncertain as the fog that rose from the canals at dawn. He was 47 years old. He had created a handful of masterpieces and abandoned a far greater number of projects. He had filled thousands of pages with ideas that no one else could read and no one else could understand. He had dreamed of a bronze horse that would stand for centuries and watched it dissolve into mud. And yet, his greatest works were still ahead of him. The portrait that would become the most famous painting in human history had not yet been begun. The anatomical studies that would anticipate modern medicine by 300 years had not yet been drawn. The notebooks that would one day be recognized as the most extraordinary record of a human mind ever set down on paper were still being filled, page by page, in that restless, backward-flowing script by a left hand that never stopped moving. The road stretched out before him, and Leonardo, as he had always done, kept walking. The language of water, of all the subjects that occupied Leonardo da Vinci's extraordinary mind, the flight of birds, the structure of the human body, the mathematics of perspective, the mechanics of machines, none held his attention as long, as deeply, or as tenderly as water. From his earliest surviving drawing, a landscape of the Arno Valley sketched in pen and ink on the 5th day of August 1473, when he was just 21 years old, to the apocalyptic deluge drawings of his final years, water was the thread that ran through the entire fabric of his life's work. It was the subject to which he returned again and again, with a devotion that went beyond scientific curiosity into something closer to reverence. And tonight, we are going to pause the forward motion of Leonardo's life story and spend some time where he spent so much of his beside the water, watching it, listening to it, trying, as he tried, to understand what it is telling us. Begin by imagining a riverbank, a specific riverbank in a specific place, the Arno, somewhere upstream from Florence, on a late afternoon in autumn. The light is golden and low, slanting through the trees that line the bank, casting long shadows across the water's surface. The air is cool, but not cold, carrying the damp, earthy smell of fallen leaves decomposing at the water's edge. That particular scent, both sweet and slightly bitter, that marks the transition from the warmth of summer to the chill of approaching winter. The sound of the river is constant but not monotonous, a complex layered texture of gurgles, splashes, and low murmurs, punctuated by the occasional louder note where the current encounters a rock or a submerged branch and breaks into white foam before reforming and continuing downstream. Leonardo is sitting on the bank. His back rests against the trunk of a willow tree. His notebook is open on his knees. His pen moves across the page. Not quickly, not with the urgency of a man trying to capture a fleeting moment, but slowly, deliberately, as if he were transcribing something that has been there for millennia and will be there for millennia more. He is watching the water flow around a stone. It sounds simple. It sounds perhaps like a trivial thing for a great mind to devote its attention to. But watch with him for a moment, and you begin to see what he sees. The water approaches the stone as a smooth, unified current. When it meets the stone's upstream face, it divides, not cleanly, not in a simple fork, but in a complex three-dimensional pattern. Some of the water flows over the top of the stone, creating a thin, glassy sheet that catches the light and breaks it into shimmering fragments. Some flows around the sides, accelerating as it is squeezed through the narrower channels between the stone and the riverbed. And behind the stone, in the sheltered space on its downstream side, the water does something extraordinary. It curls back on itself, forming a pair of rotating vortices that spin in opposite directions, their surfaces dimpled and textured like the skin of a living thing. Leonardo draws these vortices with a precision and a beauty that rivals anything in his painting. His pen traces spirals within spirals, each one slightly different from the last, each one capturing a different moment in the water's endless, restless self-transformation. He writes notes alongside the drawings, describing what he observes. The water that strikes the obstacle turns back with a circular movement, he writes in his mirror script, and in its return meets the water that comes after it. And after striking this water, it rises toward the air and then falls back into the river. He sees what modern fluid dynamics, with its computer simulations and mathematical models, would not fully describe for another 5 centuries. The phenomenon of turbulence. He sees that water, for all its apparent simplicity, is one of the most complex phenomena in nature, that its behavior at any given moment is the result of an almost infinite number of interacting forces. Gravity, momentum, viscosity, surface tension, the shape of the container through which it flows, the speed and direction of the wind above it, the temperature of the air and the water itself. He sees that a river is not a thing but a process, not a noun but a verb, a continuous, irreversible flow that never repeats itself exactly, that is always and forever in the act of becoming something new. This understanding was not abstract for Leonardo, it was deeply personal. Water, for him, was not merely a subject of scientific study, it was a mirror that reflected back to him the fundamental nature of reality as he understood it. And the reality he saw was one of ceaseless motion, of perpetual transformation, of forms that emerged and dissolved and re-emerged in an endless cycle that knew no beginning and no end. In rivers, he wrote, the water that you touch is the last of what has passed and the first of that which comes. So with time present. It is one of the most quietly profound sentences he ever wrote. In just 2 lines, he connects the movement of water to the movement of time itself, and to the nature of human experience, which exists always and only in the present moment, that thin, dissolving boundary between what has already happened and what has not yet begun. His engagement with water was not limited to contemplation. Leonardo was also a practical engineer, and throughout his career, he was involved in projects that sought to harness, redirect, or control the flow of water for human purposes. In Milan, he studied the city's canal system, the navigli, with the same intensity he brought to everything else, proposing improvements, designing locks, and working out the mathematics of water flow through channels of different widths and depths. His designs for canal locks, with their ingenious gate mechanisms and overflow channels, were decades ahead of their time and influenced the development of waterway engineering throughout Europe. In 1503, during one of his returns to Florence, he was involved in an even more ambitious project, an attempt to divert the course of the Arno River itself as a military strategy in Florence's war against the rival city of Pisa. The idea was to cut a new channel that would redirect the river away from Pisa, depriving the city of its water supply and its access to the sea. Leonardo drew detailed maps and plans for the project, calculating the volume of earth that would need to be moved, the slope of the new channel, and the force of the current that would flow through it. The project was attempted. It failed. The channel, as dug by the laborers, was too shallow and too narrow to contain the river's force, and the Arno, as if refusing to be tamed by human ambition, broke through the walls of the new channel and flooded the surrounding fields. The project was abandoned, and the Arno continued on its ancient course to the sea, indifferent to the plans of engineers and generals. Leonardo, characteristically, seems to have been more interested in understanding why the project failed than in lamenting its failure. He studied the episode and drew conclusions about the relationship between the volume of water, the speed of flow, and the capacity of a channel. Conclusions that, when expressed mathematically, anticipated the principles that would later be formalized by hydraulic engineers in the 17th and 18th centuries. But it was in his later years, particularly in the final decade of his life, that Leonardo's engagement with water took on its most extraordinary and most haunting form. Between roughly 1510 and 1518, he produced a series of drawings that scholars call the Deluge series, images of apocalyptic floods in which water becomes a force of absolute destruction, swallowing cities, uprooting mountains, and reducing the entire human world to rubble and foam. These drawings are unlike anything else in Leonardo's work. They are not illustrations for any text. They are not designs for any project. They are not studies from observation, since no human being has ever witnessed destruction on the scale they depict. They seem to come from somewhere deep inside Leonardo's imagination, from a place where scientific observation meets prophetic vision, where the patient study of how water curls around a stone meets a terrifying awareness of the forces that lie just beyond the edge of human control. And yet, even in these visions of destruction, there is beauty. The water in the Deluge drawings moves with the same spiraling, curling patterns that Leonardo observed in rivers and streams. The same vortices, the same braided currents, the same restless self-transformation. It is as though he is saying, the force that gently polishes a river pebble and the force that destroys a civilization are the same force. They differ only in scale. The universe does not distinguish between creation and destruction. It knows only motion. There is a deep and universal truth in this vision that reaches far beyond the specific study of water. Everyone who has ever watched a river for more than a few minutes has sensed it. That strange, hypnotic feeling of watching something that is simultaneously always the same and never the same, always moving and never arriving, always changing and never complete. It is a feeling that touches on the deepest questions of human existence, the nature of time, the meaning of impermanence, the relationship between order and chaos, the question of whether anything in the universe is truly permanent, or whether everything, in the end, is water, flowing, transforming, dissolving, and reforming in patterns we can glimpse but never fully grasp. Leonardo grasped more of these patterns than anyone before him. He saw, in the humble motion of water over stones, a language that the universe was speaking, a language of spirals and vortices and waves that repeated itself at every scale, from the tiny whirlpool behind a pebble in a stream to the vast rotation of clouds around a distant storm. He recorded this language in his notebooks with a fidelity and a beauty that still astonishes scientists and artists alike. And perhaps the most remarkable thing about his lifelong study of water is that it was driven not by any practical purpose, not by the desire to build a better canal or divert a river or predict a flood, but by something much simpler and more profound. He watched water because it fascinated him, because it was beautiful, because it was alive with a complexity that he could sense but never fully capture, no matter how many pages he filled with his spiraling drawings and his backward-flowing script. The river continues to flow. The light on its surface continues to change. The sound of it, that ceaseless murmur, continues to fill the air beside its banks, as it has for thousands of years, as it will for thousands more. And somewhere in a notebook in faded brown ink, a left-handed man has written, "The water you touch in a river is the last of what has passed, and the first of that which comes." The observation is simple. Its depth is infinite, like water itself. The Codex of Wings. If water was the subject to which Leonardo returned most often, flight was the one that haunted him most deeply. It was, in the most literal sense, the dream of his life. A dream that began, if we trust his own account, in the cradle, with the soft brush of a kite's tail feathers against his infant mouth, and that persisted, undimmed and undiminished, until the very last years of his existence, when his hand could barely hold a pen, but his eyes still followed the arcing paths of birds across the sky. Let us set the scene for this dream on a specific afternoon. It is the spring of 1505, and Leonardo is in Florence, standing on the terrace of a building near the Piazza della Signoria. He is 53 years old. His hair, which was once dark and thick, has turned silver, and he wears it long, falling past his shoulders in the style of a philosopher rather than a courtier. His beard, also silver, is neatly trimmed. He stands very still, his head tilted slightly upward, his eyes tracking something in the sky. Above him, a kestrel hangs in the warm air that rises from the sun-heated stone of the piazza. The bird is not flapping its wings, it is hovering, suspended in place by the invisible column of thermal air that flows upward from the baked earth below. Its wings are spread wide, their tips slightly curved, their feathers adjusting constantly in tiny, almost imperceptible movements that keep the bird perfectly balanced in the shifting current. Its tail fans and contracts, acting as a rudder, correcting for gusts and eddies with a precision that no human engineer has ever matched. Leonardo watches, and as he watches, his left hand moves across the page of the notebook resting on the stone ledge before him. His charcoal pencil traces the angle of the wing, the precise degree to which it tilts forward and back, the slight twist along its length that allows the inner portion to generate lift while the outer portion controls direction. He notes the position of the tail, the spacing of the primary feathers, the way the bird's body shifts its weight from one side to the other as it adjusts to a change in the wind. He has been making observations like these for decades. His notebooks contain hundreds of drawings of birds in flight, not the decorative, symbolic birds that populate medieval manuscripts, but real birds, observed with the same ruthless accuracy that he brings to his anatomical studies. He draws birds from below, from the side, from above. He draws them in the moment of takeoff, when the wings beat with maximum force and the body lifts against gravity. He draws them in the moment of landing, when the wings spread wide and angle upward, creating drag to slow the descent. He draws them soaring, gliding, diving, turning. Each drawing is accompanied by notes, precise, technical, analytical, that describe not just what the bird is doing, but why it is doing it, what physical forces are at work, and how those forces might be replicated by a machine. The culmination of these decades of observation is a small, extraordinary manuscript that Leonardo compiled around 1505 and 1506, known today as the Codex on the Flight of Birds. It consists of 18 folios, 36 pages of dense text and intricate drawings written in his characteristic mirror script and covered with sketches that range from detailed anatomical studies of bird wings to schematic diagrams of flying machines. The manuscript is small enough to hold in two hands, its pages slightly yellowed with age, its ink faded to a warm brown. It is kept today in the Royal Library of Turin in a climate-controlled case under soft light, where visitors can look at it through glass and wonder at the density of thought contained in so small a space. What the Codex reveals is a mind working at the very edge of what was possible in its era, and in some respects, considerably beyond it. Leonardo understood correctly that bird flight was not magic, but mechanics. It obeyed the same physical laws that governed the motion of all objects. A bird's wing was not fundamentally different from a lever or a sail. It was a surface that interacted with the air in specific, predictable ways to produce lift, thrust, and control. If those interactions could be understood precisely enough, they could, in principle, be reproduced by a human-made device. He studied the way birds adjusted their wings to different wind conditions. He observed that in calm air, a bird needed to beat its wings vigorously to maintain altitude, but in a strong headwind, it could soar with its wings nearly motionless, using the force of the wind itself to generate the upward pressure that kept it aloft. He noted that birds use their tails as rudders, shifting them left or right to change direction, and up or down to control the angle of their ascent or descent. He studied the center of gravity, what he called the center of resistance, and observed that a bird constantly shifted this center forward and back by extending or retracting its neck and legs, maintaining the delicate balance between lift and weight that allowed sustained flight. These observations were, in their way, astonishingly modern. The concept of the center of gravity in flight, the understanding of lift as a function of wing angle and airspeed, the recognition that control surfaces are needed for stability, these are principles that would not be formally articulated by aeronautical science until the 19th century. Leonardo arrived at them through pure observation, without instruments, without mathematics beyond basic geometry, armed with nothing but his eyes, his pen, and his inexhaustible patience. But understanding flight in theory and achieving it in practice are, of course, two very different things. And it is here that Leonardo's story becomes both magnificent and poignant. The story of a man who saw the sky as a door that he could almost, but never quite, open. His earliest flying machine designs, from the 1480s and 1490s, were ornithopters, devices that attempted to mimic the flapping motion of bird wings using human muscle power. These designs are beautiful, ingenious, and fundamentally flawed. They feature articulated wooden frames covered in starched linen or leather, with a system of pulleys, cables, and foot pedals that would allow a human operator, lying prone in the center of the device, to move the wings up and down by pushing with his feet and pulling with his. The drawings are extraordinarily detailed, with notes specifying the dimensions of every component, the type of wood to be used, the method of joining the parts, and the direction in which the joints should flex. The problem, the insurmountable problem that Leonardo could sense but never fully articulate, was power. A bird's flight muscles, relative to its body weight, are enormously more powerful than a human's arms and legs. A human being simply does not have enough muscular strength to flap a pair of wings large enough to lift his own weight into the air. Leonardo suspected this. In his notes, he made calculations comparing the wingspan and body weight of birds to the equivalent dimensions that would be needed for a human-sized flying machine. And the numbers were discouraging, but he could not quite bring himself to accept the conclusion that they implied. The dream was too strong. The sky was too close. As the years passed, his designs evolved. He moved away from flapping wing machines toward designs that more closely resembled what we would today call gliders, fixed-wing devices that would ride the wind rather than fight against it. These later designs are more practical, more elegant, and closer to the principles that would eventually enable human flight 4 centuries later. He sketched a device with rigid, bat-like wings that the operator could steer by shifting his body weight, a concept remarkably similar to modern hang gliders. He designed a rudimentary parachute, a pyramidal structure of linen stretched over a wooden frame that he claimed would allow a man to jump from any height without injury. He even sketched what appears to be an aerial screw, a helical surface, like a corkscrew turned on its side, that he proposed could be spun rapidly to generate upward thrust, a concept that is sometimes described, with considerable generosity, as a precursor to the helicopter. None of these devices flew. None of them could have flown, given the materials and power sources available in the 15th century. The aerial screw, however beautiful as a concept, would have required a motor that would not be invented for another 400 years. The ornithopter demanded more strength than any human body could provide. Even the glider, the most promising of his designs, would have required an understanding of aerodynamics, of airfoil shapes, of angle of attack, of the relationship between speed and lift, that was still centuries in the future. And Leonardo, in his honest moments, seems to have known this. There is a passage in the Codex on the flight of birds, where he writes, with a confidence that sounds almost like an incantation. The great bird will take its first flight from the summit of Monte Ceccheri, filling the universe with wonder, filling all the chronicles with its fame, and bringing eternal glory to the nest where it was born. Monte Ceccheri is a hill just outside Florence. Its name, by a lovely coincidence, derives from the Italian word for swan. Whether Leonardo ever actually attempted a flight from this hill, whether he or an assistant ever strapped themselves into one of his devices and leaped into the air, is unknown. Vasari makes no mention of it. No contemporary account describes it. The silence of the historical record suggests that the great bird never flew. The hill remains, but the sky above it was never crossed by Leonardo's wings. And yet, and this is the part that matters, the failure does not diminish the achievement. Leonardo's study of flight was not important because it produced a flying machine. It was important because it produced something rarer and more enduring, a way of looking at the natural world that combined the precision of science with the wonder of art. He looked at a bird in flight and saw not a symbol, not a metaphor, not a sign from God, but a physical system operating according to physical laws. Laws that could be observed, recorded, analyzed, and potentially reproduced. This way of looking, empirical, systematic, patient, reverent, was the foundation of modern science, even though Leonardo himself did not use the word and would not have recognized the discipline in its modern form. The tension between boundless imagination and the limitations of one's own era is not unique to Leonardo. It is a tension that every visionary mind has felt, every person who has seen a possibility that the world was not yet ready to realize. There is a loneliness in that vision, a particular ache that comes from standing at the edge of what is known and looking out at what might be, knowing that the bridge between the two has not yet been built. Leonardo felt this ache more deeply than most, because his vision was wider than most, and the gap between what he could imagine and what he could achieve was correspondingly vast. But he kept looking up. He kept watching the birds. He kept filling his notebooks with drawings of wings and wind, and the precise angle at which a feather bends under the pressure of the air. And in doing so, he left behind not a machine that could fly, but something that may be more valuable, a record of the human mind in the act of dreaming beyond itself, reaching, always reaching, toward the sky. The kestrel above the piazza has moved on. It caught a gust and was carried upward, spiraling lazily, its wings barely moving, until it became a dark speck against the pale blue of the Florentine sky, and then vanished altogether. Leonardo closes his notebook. The charcoal pencil goes back into the pouch at his belt. He turns and walks down the stone steps, back into the narrow streets, back into the noise and bustle of a city that has no idea at all, what the silver-haired man in their midst is thinking about. The anatomy of shadows. There is a particular quality of silence that belongs to the hours between midnight and dawn. A silence that is not merely the absence of sound, but a presence in itself. A kind of acoustic weight that presses gently on the eardrums and makes every small noise. The hiss of a candle flame, the creak of a wooden floor, the slow drip of water from a stone ceiling seem amplified, significant, almost musical. It is in this silence, in rooms lit by nothing more than the unsteady glow of tallow candles and oil lamps, that Leonardo da Vinci conducted some of the most extraordinary work of his extraordinary life. He dissected the dead. Let us be clear about what this meant in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. Anatomical dissection was not a routine academic exercise. It was rare, legally restricted, morally fraught, and physically revolting. The Church did not formally prohibit it. This is a common misconception, but it did not encourage it either, and the cultural attitude toward the cutting open of human corpses ranged from deep unease to outright horror. Dissections, when they occurred, were typically performed in medical schools during the winter months, when the cold slowed the process of decomposition, and they were public spectacles in which a professor read aloud from an ancient text, usually Galen, the 2nd century Greek physician, while a barber surgeon did the actual cutting. The professor rarely looked at the body. The students rarely questioned the text. The body was an illustration of what was already known, not a source of new knowledge. Leonardo's approach was entirely different. He worked alone, or nearly alone, in hospitals and morgues, with no text to guide him and no authority to defer to. He looked at what was actually there, not at what Galen said should be there, but at what the human body, in its intricate, messy, astonishing reality, actually contained. Imagine the scene. It is a winter night, perhaps 1510 or 1511. The place is the hospital of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence, or possibly the Ospedale Maggiore in Milan, both institutions where Leonardo is known to have obtained bodies for dissection. The room is small, cold, and sparsely furnished. A stone table, a wooden stool, a row of candles set in iron holders along one wall. The smell is the first thing that registers, not the sharp, clean smell of a modern laboratory, but a heavy, complex odor of preservation herbs layered over something deeper and more unsettling. Rosemary, camphor, and vinegar have been used to slow the decay of the body that lies on the stone table, and their sharp, pungent scents fill the room like incense. Beneath them, inescapable and unmistakable, is the sweet, heavy smell of death itself, a smell that clings to clothing and hair and hands and does not wash away easily. Leonardo stands at the table. He wears a simple working garment, perhaps a linen smock over his usual clothing, stained and discolored from previous sessions. His sleeves are rolled to the elbow. His hands, the same hands that painted the luminous face of the angel in Verrocchio's baptism and the enigmatic smile of the Mona Lisa, are holding a small, sharp knife. Before him lies the body of an old man who died, as Leonardo would later record, peacefully in his bed at the age of approximately 100 years. A claim that was probably exaggerated, but that suggests a man who had died of natural causes, whose body showed the accumulated effects of a long life. Leonardo begins to cut, and as he cuts, he draws. This is the remarkable thing, the thing that separates Leonardo's anatomical work from that of every other dissector of his era. He did not merely look at what he found inside the human body. He recorded it with the same visual precision, the same attention to light and shadow and three-dimensional form that he brought to his paintings. His anatomical drawings are not diagrams, they are works of art, exquisitely rendered depictions of muscles, bones, organs, and blood vessels that combine scientific accuracy with an aesthetic beauty that still takes the breath away. Between roughly 1508 and 1513, Leonardo performed dissections of some 30 human bodies, men and women, old and young, and produced more than 240 individual anatomical drawings, accompanied by thousands of words of written notes. He drew the skeleton from multiple angles, showing how the bones fit together at the joints with a precision that anticipated modern orthopedic science. He drew the muscles of the arm, the shoulder, and the leg, peeling back layer after layer in a series of progressive dissections that showed how the muscles overlapped and interacted, like the ropes and pulleys of the machines he designed in his engineering notebooks. He drew the heart, and here his observations were most extraordinary. Working with the hearts of oxen, which are similar in structure to human hearts, and, when he could obtain them, human hearts from dissected bodies, Leonardo identified the 4 chambers of the heart and the valves that controlled the flow of blood between them. He observed that the valves opened and closed in response to the pressure of the blood, and he made wax casts of the aorta, the great artery leading from the heart, to study the way blood flowed through it. He noticed that as blood passed through the aortic valve, it created small vortices, swirling currents, in the sinuses behind the valve leaflets, and he proposed that these vortices were what caused the valve to close after each heartbeat. This observation was not confirmed by modern science until the 1960s, when researchers using high-speed cameras and dye injection techniques observed exactly the phenomenon Leonardo had described. He had been right, 5 centuries before anyone could prove it. He had seen, with nothing but his eyes and his knife and his candle, something that required 20th century technology to verify. He drew the brain, removing the skull in sections and making a wax cast of the ventricles, the fluid-filled chambers within the brain, to to determine their precise shape and size. He drew the eye, tracing the path of light through the lens and speculating on how images were formed on the retina. He drew the muscles of the face, identifying the specific muscles responsible for smiling, frowning, and other expressions. An investigation that connected his anatomical work directly to his work as a painter, since the ability to render human expression convincingly depended on understanding the physical mechanisms that produced it. He drew the spine, showing its double S-curve with such accuracy that his drawings could be used as illustrations in a modern anatomy textbook. He drew the fetus in the womb, one of the most famous and most beautiful of all his anatomical drawings, showing the unborn child curled in its amniotic sac with a tenderness that transcends science and enters the realm of pure wonder. And through all of this work, running through it like a thread of gold through a dark fabric, was a single, unifying perception. The human body and the natural world were built on the same principle. The branching of blood vessels in the body mirrored the branching of rivers in a landscape. The spiraling of hair around the crown of the head mirrored the spiraling of water in a vortex. The layers of muscle in the arm mirrored the layers of earth in a geological cross-section. Everything was connected. Everything followed the same deep patterns. The microcosm of the body and the macrocosm of the universe were reflections of each other, written in the same language, governed by the same laws. This perception was not merely poetic. It was the foundation of Leonardo's entire intellectual project. The reason he could move so fluidly between painting and anatomy, between engineering and natural philosophy, between the study of water and the study of the human heart. He did not see these as separate disciplines. He saw them as different windows into the same room, different perspectives on a single, unified reality that he spent his entire life trying to understand. But there is another connection to be drawn here, one that takes us from the dissecting table back to the painter's easel. Leonardo's anatomical work and his painting technique were not merely parallel pursuits. They were deeply, intimately intertwined. Consider sfumato, the painting technique that became Leonardo's most famous contribution to the art of the Western world. The word comes from the Italian sfumare, meaning to evaporate or to vanish like smoke, and it describes the technique of applying paint in layers so thin and so translucent that the boundaries between light and shadow, between one color and the next, dissolve into gradual, imperceptible transitions rather than hard lines. In a painting executed in sfumato, there are no edges, there are no outlines, there is only light passing through veils of color, creating the illusion of three-dimensional form with an almost supernatural softness. This technique was not a trick. It was not a stylistic choice. It was the direct result of Leonardo's understanding, gained through hours of dissection and observation, of how light actually behaves when it encounters a human face. He knew from his anatomical studies that the human face is not a flat surface. It is a complex, three-dimensional landscape of bones, muscles, fat, and skin, each layer with its own opacity and reflectivity, each contributing to the way light is absorbed, reflected, and scattered as it moves across the surface. He knew that the transition from light to shadow on a real face is never abrupt. It is gradual, complex, and infinitely subtle, a cascade of micro-transitions that the eye perceives as a smooth, continuous flow rather than as a series of discrete steps. Sfumato was his attempt to reproduce this reality in paint, and the tool that made it possible was his anatomical eye, the eye that had learned, in those cold, candlelit rooms, to see beneath the surface of things, to understand the hidden structures that gave rise to the visible world. There is a lonely courage in what Leonardo did in those rooms. Dissection was not pleasant. The smell was terrible. The work was physically demanding, emotionally taxing, and socially marginal. He worked alone, in silence, often through the night, bending over bodies that no one else wanted to look at, searching for truths that no one else had thought to seek. He did it not for fame. His anatomical work was never published in his lifetime, and remained unknown for centuries after his death. But for the simple, fierce, uncompromising need to understand. "I have dissected more than 30 human bodies," he wrote in his notes, "destroying all the various members, removing down to the very smallest particles of flesh which surrounded these veins, without causing any effusion of blood other than the imperceptible bleeding of the capillary veins." The precision of this statement, the care with which he describes his technique, the pride he takes in the delicacy of his work, tells us everything we need to know about the spirit in which he was not a butcher. He was an artist, working with a knife instead of a brush, but with the same reverence for the material before him, the same determination to see it truly, the same refusal to look away from what was real. The candles have burned low. The shadows in the room have deepened. Leonardo straightens his back, wipes his hands on a cloth that smells of vinegar and rosemary, and looks down at the drawings spread across the side table. Drawings of a precision and a beauty that the world will not see for another 300 years. He rolls them carefully, ties them with a string, and places them in the leather satchel that holds his notebook. Then he blows out the candles, one by one, and steps out into the night air, which is cold and clean and smells of nothing but stone and sky. The stars are out. He stands for a moment, breathing, letting the cold air fill his lungs and wash away the smell of the dissecting room. Above him, the same sky that the kite crossed in his infant memory, the same sky that the kestrel rides above the piazza, the same sky that he has spent years trying to reach with his wooden wings and linen sail. It is still there. It is still unreachable. But tonight, he has been looking in the other direction, not up at the sky, but inward, into the hidden architecture of the human body. And what he has found there is no less vast, no less beautiful, and no less mysterious. He pulls his cloak around his shoulders and walks home through the empty streets. His footsteps echo on the stone. The city sleeps, and in the leather satchel at his side, a new page of knowledge has been added to the record of what it means to be human. The woman with the quiet smile. Somewhere around the year 1503, in a studio in Florence, a room with a single large window facing north, designed to admit a steady, even light that did not shift or change as the sun moved across the sky, Leonardo began a painting that would become, over the course of the following centuries, the most famous image in the history of Western art. He did not know this. He did not know that the small wooden panel on his easel, a piece of poplar wood, roughly 30 inches tall and 21 inches wide, about the size of a modern newspaper opened flat, would one day hang behind bulletproof glass in the largest art museum in the world, visited by millions of people each year who would line up for hours simply to stand before it for a few seconds. He knew only that a Florentine silk merchant named Francesco del Giocondo had asked him to paint a portrait of his wife, Lisa, and that something about this commission, something about this woman, or this moment, or this particular intersection of subject and artist had captured his attention in a way that would not let go. The woman who sat before him was not, by the standards of the time, a figure of great importance. Lisa Gherardini was born in 1479, the daughter of a minor Florentine noble family with more lineage than wealth. She married Francesco del Giocondo at the age of 15, a respectable match, though not a brilliant one. And by 1503, she was the mother of several children, a woman of the comfortable merchant class, neither rich nor poor, neither powerful nor obscure. She was, in short, an ordinary person, and yet, something about her, something that Leonardo saw and that we can only guess at, made her the subject of the most enduring portrait ever painted. What did he see? We will never know with certainty, but we can observe what he did. He began, as he always did, with the underdrawing, a faint sketch on the white gesso surface of the panel, establishing the basic composition. The three-quarter view of the face, the slightly turned body, the hands resting one upon the other in the lap, the hint of a balcony or parapet behind her. Then he began to paint, and here his technique departed from everything that was standard practice in Florence. Most portrait painters of the era worked relatively quickly. They established the forms with a firm underdrawing, blocked in the major areas of color, and then refined the details, layer by layer, until the painting was complete. The process might take weeks or a few months. Leonardo's process took years. He did not block in colors and refine them. He built up the image from within, applying layer after layer of translucent paint, glazes so thin that each one was nearly invisible, each one slightly modifying the tone and hue of the layers beneath it without obscuring them. He dissolved lead oxide in walnut oil and applied it in films thinner than a human hair, building up the luminosity of skin, not by painting the color of skin, but by creating the conditions under which light itself seemed to emanate from beneath the surface, as it does from real flesh. This was sfumato carried to its ultimate expression. In the Mona Lisa, there are no visible brushstrokes. There are no hard edges. The transition from the illuminated left side of Lisa's face to the shadowed right side occurs so gradually, through so many infinitesimal tonal steps, that the eye cannot identify the point where light becomes shadow. The effect is uncanny. The face seems to exist not on the surface of the panel, but behind it, as though the wood has become a window through which we glimpse a real person in real space, breathing real air. And then there is the smile. It has been analyzed, discussed, debated, and rhapsodized about for 500 years. And yet it remains, stubbornly, irreducibly, a mystery. It is not a full smile. It is not a half smile. It is something in between. A suggestion, a possibility, a flicker of expression that seems to change depending on where the viewer's eyes focus. Look directly at the mouth, and the smile seems to fade. Look at the eyes, or at the background, and the smile returns, playing at the corners of the lips like sunlight on the surface of water. Leonardo achieved this effect through a technique so subtle that it was not fully understood until modern scientific analysis was brought to bear on the painting. The smile exists primarily in the lower frequency visual information, the broad tonal transitions, rather than the fine details, which means that it is more visible to peripheral vision than to direct focus. When the viewer looks directly at the mouth, the eye's high-resolution central vision picks up the fine details and the smile seems to dissolve. When the viewer looks elsewhere, the peripheral vision picks up the broader tonal patterns and the smile reappears. It is, in effect, a smile that exists in the act of looking away. A smile that is always just at the edge of perception, always just beyond the reach of certainty. Whether Leonardo planned this effect consciously or achieved it intuitively, we cannot know. But it is perfectly consistent with his understanding of the world, a world in which nothing is fixed, nothing is static, nothing has a hard edge or a definitive form. Reality, for Leonardo, was not a collection of solid objects. It was a flowing, shifting, dissolving process, and a face, a living face, was the most fluid thing of all, always in motion, always changing, always expressing something that words could not quite capture and paint could only approximate. He carried this painting with him for the rest of his life. He never delivered it to Francesco del Giocondo. He took it from Florence to Milan, from Milan to Rome, from Rome across the Alps to France. For 16 years, it traveled with him, wrapped in cloth, packed among his notebooks and his few possessions, always within reach, always in progress. He continued to work on it, adding another glaze here, refining a shadow there, adjusting the mysterious landscape that unfolds behind Lisa's shoulders, that dreamlike terrain of winding rivers and jagged rocks and misty distances that seems to belong to no real place on Earth, or to every place on Earth seen from a very great distance, or through very old eyes. Why did he never finish it? The question presupposes that it was meant to be finished, that there was a final state, a completed version toward which Leonardo was working, and which he failed, through distraction or perfectionism, or the simple passage of time, to reach. But perhaps the question is wrong. Perhaps the Mona Lisa was never meant to be finished, because Leonardo understood, more deeply than any artist before or since, that reality itself is never finished. Every face changes with every passing second. Every smile is a momentary arrangement of muscles and light and emotion that will never occur in exactly the same way again. To fix a face in paint, to declare it done, to say, this is how she looked, this would be for Leonardo a kind of lie. The truth was, in the process, in the endless, patient accumulation of translucent layers, each one bringing the image infinitesimally closer to life without ever quite arriving. The landscape behind Lisa reinforces this sense of eternal incompletion. On the left side of the painting, the terrain is higher, with a winding road that disappears into mountains. On the right side, the terrain is lower, with a bridge crossing a river that flows toward a distant lake or sea. The two sides do not quite match. The horizon lines are at slightly different heights, creating a subtle sense of disjunction that most viewers feel without consciously recognizing. The landscape seems to shift and breathe, as if the very earth behind Lisa is as alive and as impermanent as her smile. There is a profound and very human truth embedded in this painting, a truth that goes beyond technique and art history and reaches into the experience of anyone who has ever tried to hold on to a moment, a feeling, a face. The world will not hold still. The people we love will not hold still. The smile on the face of someone we cherish is, by its very nature, fleeting. Here for an instant, gone in the next, existing most vividly, not when we stare at it directly, but when we catch it from the corner of our eye as we look at something else. Leonardo, in the Mona Lisa, painted this truth. The truth of impermanence, the truth that the most beautiful things in life are the ones we can never quite possess. And he painted it so well that 500 years of staring have not been enough to exhaust it. The north-facing window of the studio lets in its even, pearly light. The smell of walnut oil and lead white hangs in the still air. The poplar panel sits on the easel, its surface dry to the touch, waiting for the next imperceptible layer. And somewhere in the room, a man is looking at a woman's face and seeing in it everything he has ever learned about light, shadow, anatomy, the movement of water, the flight of birds, the structure of the earth, and the nature of time itself. He picks up his brush. The bristles are so fine they could paint a single eyelash. He loads it with a glaze so thin it is almost invisible, just enough to soften, by the smallest imaginable degree, the shadow beneath her left eye. One more layer, one more step toward the truth, never arriving, always closer. The Wanderer. After the fall of Ludovico Sforza and the French occupation of Milan in 1499, Leonardo's life entered a phase that was characterized less by the creation of masterpieces than by something quieter and, in its own way, more revealing. The experience of not belonging anywhere. For the next 17 years, between 1499 and 1516, he moved from city to city with a restlessness that was partly circumstantial. The political upheavals of Renaissance Italy made stable patronage increasingly difficult to find, and partly temperamental. He was a man who had never quite belonged, not since his illegitimate birth in that stone house in Anciano, and this fundamental displacement, this sense of being always slightly outside whatever world he inhabited, followed him through every court and every commission, like a shadow that could not be separated from the body that cast it. He went first to Venice in the early months of 1500, arriving in a city that was, in its own way, as extraordinary as Florence or Milan. Venice was a city built on water, literally, impossibly, magnificently built on water. Its palaces and churches and narrow streets resting on millions of wooden piles driven into the muddy floor of a shallow lagoon. The light in Venice was unlike anything Leonardo had seen before. Not the golden clarity of Florence, not the grey dampness of Milan, but a shimmering silvery luminescence that came from the light bouncing off the water and reflecting upward onto the undersides of buildings, so that walls and ceilings seemed to glow with a soft, ambient radiance that had no single source. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, and the faint, not unpleasant decay of a city that was always, slowly, sinking. Leonardo's stay in Venice was brief, a few months at most, and his primary role was practical rather than artistic. The Venetian Republic was concerned about the threat of Ottoman Turkish invasion, and Leonardo was consulted as a military engineer. He proposed a system of movable barriers that could be used to flood the valleys leading to Venice, creating artificial lakes that would block an advancing army. The plan was considered, admired for its ingenuity, and never implemented. Leonardo moved on. He returned to Florence in the spring of 1500, and for the next few years, he worked in a city that was still recovering from the convulsions of the 1490s. The expulsion of the Medici, the rise and fall of the fiery preacher Savonarola, the restoration of a fragile republic. It was during this period that he began the Mona Lisa and received the commission for the Battle of Anghiari, a monumental mural for the Great Council Hall of the Palazzo della Signoria. The Battle of Anghiari was to be Leonardo's largest and most ambitious painting. A massive scene of cavalry combat, full of rearing horses and struggling soldiers, that would face, on the opposite wall, a companion piece painted by the young Michelangelo. The confrontation between the two greatest artists of the age, Leonardo at 50, the established master, and Michelangelo at 29, the explosive young rival, was the talk of Florence. Their personalities could hardly have been more different. Leonardo was elegant, courteous, enigmatic, slow to commit and slower to complete. Michelangelo was intense, quarrelsome, physically unkempt, and driven by a furious energy that produced finished works at a pace Leonardo could not match. They disliked each other, though the exact nature and intensity of their animosity is difficult to gauge through the veil of later legend. What is clear is that the artistic establishment of Florence watched the duel commission with the fascination of spectators at a duel. Neither painting was completed. Michelangelo abandoned his cartoon, his full-scale preliminary drawing, when Pope Julius II summoned him to Rome to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Leonardo, characteristically, finished the cartoon and began painting the wall, but his experimental technique, once again, he was working with an oil-based medium on a wall surface rather than using traditional fresco, failed catastrophically. The paint did not adhere properly. It ran and blistered. According to some accounts, he tried to speed the drying process by bringing braziers close to the wall, and the heat caused the colors to melt and run. Whatever the precise sequence of events, the painting was eventually abandoned, and what remained was gradually painted over in subsequent decades. If any trace of it survives beneath the later frescoes, it has not yet been found. It was also during this Florentine period that Leonardo spent several months in the service of Cesare Borgia, the ruthless son of Pope Alexander VI, who was engaged in a military campaign to carve out a personal dominion in central Italy. Leonardo served as Borgia's military engineer, traveling with the army through the towns and fortresses of Romagna, drawing maps, inspecting fortifications, and designing siege equipment. It was a strange interlude, a man of boundless curiosity and gentle temperament in the service of one of the most feared and unscrupulous men in Italy. Whether Leonardo was troubled by the moral dimension of his service, we do not know. His notebooks from this period contain maps, architectural sketches, and engineering notes, but no personal reflections. He observed, he recorded, he moved on. The years that followed were a succession of departures and arrivals, of hopes raised and disappointed, of commissions begun and abandoned. He returned to Milan in 1506, summoned by the French governor Charles d'Amboise, who admired his work and offered him a generous stipend. He spent 6 years in Milan on this second stay, pursuing his anatomical studies, his water engineering projects, and his endless notebooks with the energy of a man who has found, if not a permanent home, at least a temporary shelter. But the political landscape was shifting once again. The French would lose control of Milan, regain it, and lose it once more, and each convulsion sent ripples through the lives of those who depended on their patronage. Through all of these wanderings, two figures remained constant in Leonardo's life, and they tell us something important about the kind of companionship he found. The first was Gian Giacomo Caprotti, known as Salai, a nickname that means little devil, who entered Leonardo's household in 1490 as a 10-year-old boy and remained with him, on and off, for nearly 3 decades. Salai was, By Leonardo's own account, a handful. In one of his earliest notebook entries about the boy, Leonardo lists his offences with a mixture of exasperation and bewildered affection. Thievish, stubborn, greedy, a liar. Salai stole money from Leonardo's purse. He ate the food intended for Leonardo's guests. He broke things. He lied about breaking them. And yet Leonardo kept him, clothed him, fed him, taught him to paint after a fashion, and remembered him in his will. The relationship between them has been the subject of much speculation, and its precise nature remains, like so many aspects of Leonardo's inner life, ultimately unknowable. What can be said is that Salai provided something that Leonardo's intellectual pursuits could not: the messy, unpredictable, exasperating warmth of human connection. The second figure was Francesco Melzi, who entered Leonardo's life around 1506, when Melzi was a boy of about 14, the son of a Milanese nobleman. Where Salai was wild and unreliable, Melzi was gentle, devoted, and intellectually gifted. He became Leonardo's pupil, his secretary, his traveling companion, and, ultimately, the guardian of his legacy. It was Melzi who would inherit Leonardo's notebooks after his death, and it was Melzi who would spend decades organizing and preserving them, recognizing their value at a time when few others did. The contrast between these two companions, the charming rogue and the faithful student, reveals something about the breadth of Leonardo's capacity for human connection. He was not, as popular myth sometimes suggests, a solitary genius who lived entirely in the world of ideas. He was a man who enjoyed company, who valued loyalty, who was capable of deep and lasting affection, even if he expressed it in ways that were characteristically indirect. And yet, there was a solitude at the core of his life that no companion could fully reach. It was the solitude of a mind that saw connections no one else could see, that asked questions no one else thought to ask, that perceived patterns in the flight of a bird or the flow of a river that would not be understood for centuries. Everyone who has ever felt the loneliness of thinking differently from those around them, of seeing a beauty or a complexity in the world that seems invisible to others, will recognize something of Leonardo in this description. It is a loneliness that is not incompatible with love, or with friendship, or with pleasure. It simply coexists with them, a quiet presence in the background, like the hum of a distant river that never quite falls silent. The weariness of Renaissance travel should not be underestimated. The roads were unpaved, rutted by cartwheels, and softened by rain into a thick, sticky mud that clung to shoes and the hems of cloaks and made every step an effort. Travel was slow, perhaps 20 or 30 miles a day on horseback, less on foot or in a cart, and dangerous. Bandits roamed the countryside, especially in the mountainous stretches between cities. The inns where travelers stopped for the night were often little more than stables with straw mattresses and a shared fireplace, where the air smelled of smoke and unwashed bodies, and the sound of snoring strangers filled the darkness. Leonardo, who was fastidious in his personal habits, his notebooks include recipes for rosewater soap and instructions for keeping linen fresh, must have found these conditions deeply unpleasant. And yet he kept moving. Florence, Venice, Romagna, Florence again, Milan, Florence once more, Milan once more, and finally, as the next chapter of his life would reveal, a brief, uncomfortable stay in Rome, followed by a final journey across the Alps to a destination he could not have foreseen. The road stretches out, the dust rises, the landscape changes slowly, mile by mile. Olive groves giving way to chestnut forests, flat plains rising into hills, the light shifting from the golden warmth of Tuscany to the cooler, greyer tones of Lombardy and back again. And a man of 60, his silver hair tied back, his notebooks packed in a leather case strapped to the back of a mule, rides forward into an uncertain future with the same quiet determination that has carried him this far. He does not know where he will end up. He does not know that his greatest peace is still ahead of him. He knows only that the road continues and that he must follow it, because stopping has never been something he knew how to do. The silence. After the storm. In the autumn of 1513, Leonardo arrived in Rome. He was 61 years old, and he came with high hopes. The newly elected Pope Leo X, born Giovanni de' Medici, the son of Lorenzo the Magnificent himself, was a man who loved art, who spent lavishly on cultural projects, and who had the resources of the entire papacy at his disposal. If there was a place in Italy where a man of Leonardo's talents might find a secure and generous patron, Rome seemed like it. The city he entered was a place of extremes. On one hand, it was the center of the Christian world, the seat of the papacy, a city of ancient ruins and magnificent churches, where the power of faith and the power of politics intertwined so thoroughly that it was often impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. On the other hand, it was a construction site. Pope Julius II, Leo's predecessor, had begun the demolition and reconstruction of the old St. Peter's Basilica, and the new building, designed by Bramante, who had died just the year before, was rising from the rubble in fits and starts, its massive piers and arches half-built, surrounded by scaffolding and piles of cut travertine that gave the area around the Vatican the look and feel of an enormous quarry. The air smelled of lime dust and fresh mortar. The sound of hammers and chisels echoed across the Tiber from dawn to dusk. And everywhere, on every wall and every ceiling, in every chapel and every palace, younger men were painting masterpieces. Michelangelo had finished the Sistine Chapel ceiling just the year before. Raphael, 30 years Leonardo's junior, was at the height of his powers, working on the Stanze della Segnatura, the papal apartments, filling their walls with frescoes of such beauty and intellectual sophistication that they would define the high Renaissance style for centuries to come. These were the new stars of the art world, and their brilliance, youthful, prolific, dazzling, cast a shadow over the aging Florentine, who had arrived in their midst with a reputation for genius, and a reputation, equally strong, for never finishing anything. Pope Leo received Leonardo courteously. He gave him rooms in the Belvedere Palace, within the Vatican complex, a pleasant enough lodging with views of the gardens and the distant hills. And he provided a stipend, but he did not give him a major painting commission. The reasons are not entirely clear, but the most likely explanation is simple. Leo had Raphael, who could produce a masterpiece to order, on time and on budget. Leonardo, for all his genius, could not be relied upon to deliver. And so Leonardo found himself, for the first time in his career, in a position that was at once comfortable and deeply unsatisfying. He had a roof over his head, a regular income, and access to one of the most intellectually stimulating cities in the world. But he had no great project, no grand commission, no task worthy of his abilities. He was, in the most luxurious sense possible, idle. He turned inward. He focused on mathematics, working with the young mathematician Luca Pacioli on problems of geometry and proportion. He continued his studies of optics, investigating the behavior of light and the formation of images in mirrors of different curvatures. He experimented with mechanics, designing small, intricate machines that served no practical purpose, but satisfied his insatiable need to understand how things worked. He studied geology, examining the fossils embedded in the rocks of the Roman countryside, and drawing conclusions about the age of the Earth and the history of its surface that were centuries ahead of their time. He looked at shells preserved in stone on hillsides far from the sea, and understood correctly that these hills had once been beneath the ocean, that the Earth was not a static creation, but a dynamic, evolving system shaped by the same forces of water and time that he had been studying all his life. There is a story, possibly apocryphal but telling, that captures the frustration of Leonardo's Roman period. According to Vasari, the Pope gave Leonardo a small commission, perhaps a minor painting. Leonardo immediately began experimenting with a new type of varnish, distilling oils and herbs in his rooms. When Pope Leo heard about this, he reportedly exclaimed, "Alas, this man will never get anything done, for he is thinking about the end before the beginning." The remark was unfair. Leonardo's experimentation with materials was part of his genius, not a defect, but it reflected a real and growing perception. In the eyes of the practical men who ran the world, Leonardo was an impractical dreamer, a man of infinite potential, who had never quite converted that potential into the solid, deliverable goods that patrons expected. The injustice of this perception, the gap between what the world saw and what was actually there, is one of the great ironies of Leonardo's story. The very quality that made him difficult as a commissioned artist, his refusal to commit to a fixed outcome, his need to explore every possibility before settling on any, was the same quality that made his notebooks the most extraordinary intellectual achievement of his century. The man who could not finish a painting on time was the same man who was, in his private hours, single-handedly laying the groundwork for modern anatomy, modern hydraulics, modern optics, and modern flight. But the notebooks were private. The world saw only the paintings, the few, magnificent, often unfinished paintings, and judged accordingly. There were also physical difficulties. Around this time, Leonardo seems to have suffered some kind of health event, possibly a stroke, that affected his right hand. A visitor to Rome, Cardinal Luigi of Aragon, who met Leonardo in 1517, by which time he was in France, recorded through his secretary that the master could no longer paint with his usual quality because a certain paralysis has affected his right hand. Since Leonardo was left-handed, this paralysis did not prevent him from drawing or writing, but it may have limited his ability to perform certain tasks that required the use of both hands, such as stretching canvas, preparing panels, or holding. The great bull-like strength that had characterized Leonardo in his youth, contemporaries remarked that he could bend a horseshoe with his bare hands, was fading. The feeling of arriving at the twilight of one's powers while watching younger men shine with the full brilliance of their noon is one of the most universal and most quietly painful of human experiences. It is not envy exactly, or not only envy. It is something subtler, the recognition that the world moves on, that it does not wait, that the stage one once occupied is now occupied by others who do not even know that they are standing in someone else's light. Leonardo bore this with a dignity that speaks well of his character. He did not rage against the younger artists. He did not campaign for commissions or complain about his treatment. He continued to work, quietly and steadily, on the things that interested him most, his studies of water and light and the structure of the earth. And he waited, with the patience of a man who had spent his entire life waiting for things that might never come, for whatever would happen next. What happened next was France. The garden at Clos-Lucé. In the late autumn of 1516, Leonardo da Vinci crossed the Alps. Try to imagine that journey. A man of 64, his body weakened by age and illness, his right hand partially paralyzed, riding a mule along mountain paths that were, in the early 16th century, among the most dangerous roads in Europe. The passes through the Alps, most likely the Mont Cenis Pass, the traditional route between Italy and France, rose to altitudes where the air was thin and cold, where snow lingered in the shadowed hollows even in summer, and where the path sometimes narrowed to a ledge barely wide enough for a single animal, with a sheer rock wall on one side and a drop of hundreds of feet on. The sound of the wind in the high passes was a constant keening whistle, and the cold was the kind that penetrated through layers of wool and leather and settled in the bones like something alive. With him travelled Francesco Melzi, faithful as ever, and Salai, who had been part of his household for more than 25 years. With him also travelled 3 paintings: the Mona Lisa, the St. John the Baptist, and the Virgin and Child with St. Anne. 3 works that he had carried with him for years, that he considered unfinished, and that he was apparently unwilling to leave behind. They were wrapped in cloth and packed in wooden cases strapped to the backs of mules, and they swayed gently with the motion of the animals as the small procession wound its way up the mountain paths, through the snow and the wind and the thin, piercing cold. On the other side of the mountains, France waited, and at its centre, a young king. Francis I had come to the French throne in 1515, at the age of 20. He was tall, energetic, charming, and passionately devoted to the arts and learning. He had invaded Italy almost immediately after his coronation, winning a spectacular victory at the Battle of Marignano that restored French control over Milan, and it was during this campaign that he had first encountered Leonardo's work, most likely the Last Supper, which was already famous throughout Europe despite its deteriorating condition. Francis was captivated. He determined to bring Leonardo to France, and he made the invitation in terms that no artist could refuse: a generous stipend, a comfortable home, and, most importantly, no obligation to produce any specific work. Leonardo would be free to think, to study, to paint if he wished, or simply to live out his remaining years in peace. The home that Francis provided was the manor of Clos-Lucé, a handsome stone building set in its own grounds near the royal chateau of Amboise in the Loire Valley. The two buildings were connected, according to tradition, by an underground passage that allowed the king to visit his artist without ceremony, to simply walk from his own residence to Leonardo's through a tunnel beneath the gardens, arriving unannounced for a conversation that might last an hour or an entire evening. Clos-Lucé. Close your eyes and let the name settle. It sounds like a whisper, like the rustle of leaves, like the soft closing of a door, and the place itself matches its name. It is a gentle building, not grand, not imposing, but warm and welcoming, built of the pale, honey-colored tuffeau stone that is characteristic of the Loire Valley. The walls are thick, the windows small, the rooms modestly proportioned. A large kitchen occupies the ground floor, dominated by a massive stone fireplace where a fire could burn all day, filling the room with the smell of oak smoke and warming the stone walls until they radiated heat like the body of a sleeping. Upstairs, Leonardo's bedroom looked out over a garden that sloped gently down toward a stand of trees. The bed was large, with a wooden frame and a heavy canopy of dark fabric that could be drawn closed against the drafts. The mattress was stuffed with wool or feathers. The sheets were linen, rough woven but clean. On a table beside the bed, a candlestick. On the floor, a rush mat or a small woven rug. The room was simple, comfortable, and quiet. The room of a man who had finally stopped moving. His study, in an adjacent room, was another matter. Here, the notebooks piled high. Stacks of loose papers covered the table and spilled onto chairs and the floor. Quill pens stood in jars. Ink pots of different colors sat in rows. Measuring instruments, geometric models, small mechanical devices of his own invention. Everything accumulated over a lifetime of restless inquiry was gathered in this one room, as though all the streams of his thought had finally converged into a single pool. The Loire Valley was a different world from Italy. The light was different, softer, cooler, paler, filtered through the high, thin clouds that so often covered the northern French sky. Where Tuscan light was a sculptor, carving sharp shadows and bright highlights, the light of the Loire was a watercolorist, blending tones into gentle gradations that gave the landscape a dreamlike, slightly melancholy beauty. The countryside was green, intensely, profoundly green, with rolling hills, dark forests of oak and beech, and the great Loire River itself, wide and slow and sandy-bottomed, winding through the valley like a silver ribbon laid carelessly on green velvet. The seasons here were marked not by the olive harvest and the vine pruning of Tuscany, but by the flowering of orchards in spring, when the smell of apple blossom and cherry blossom filled the air with a sweetness so intense it was almost tangible, and by the slow golden decline of autumn, when the beech trees turned copper and the first frosts etched delicate patterns on the window panes in the early morning. Leonardo lived at Clos-Lucé for nearly 3 years, from late 1516 until his death in May 1519. These were the quietest years of his life, and in many ways the most peaceful. The restless wandering that had characterized the previous 2 decades was over. The anxious search for patronage, the disappointments of unfinished commissions, the political upheavals that had uprooted him again and again, all of this had fallen away, replaced by a stillness that must have felt, to a man of Leonardo's temperament, like arriving home for the first time. King Francis visited often. The two men, the brilliant young king and the aging genius, formed a bond that transcended the usual relationship between patron and artist. Francis called Leonardo "my father," a term of affection that suggests something deeper than professional respect. They talked about art, philosophy, architecture, engineering, the nature of the universe. Francis was not merely humoring an old man. He was genuinely fascinated by Leonardo's mind, and the conversations they shared in the quiet rooms of Clos Lucé or in the gardens as the evening light faded over the valley were among the last great pleasures of Leonardo's life. What did Leonardo do during these final years? He drew, he wrote, he thought. His notebooks from this period contain studies of geometry, particularly the study of how circles and squares could be transformed into equivalent areas, a problem that fascinated mathematicians of his era. He continued his study of water, observing the flow of the nearby Amasa River and drawing the swirling vortices and braided currents that had captivated him for decades. He designed plans for a new royal palace and an ideal city, complete with canals and wide streets and buildings oriented to catch the best light. Plans that were admired by Francis, but never built. And he worked on his paintings. The St. John the Baptist, with its mysterious, smiling figure emerging from a dark background, pointing upward with one finger as if directing the viewer's attention towards something just beyond the edge of the canvas, may have received its final touches. The Virgin and Child with St. Anne, that complex and beautiful composition showing 3 generations of a family intertwined in a single embrace, may also have been worked on. And the Mona Lisa, always the Mona Lisa, that painting that refused to be finished, that kept receiving one more imperceptible layer of glaze, one more infinitesimal adjustment, as if Leonardo and Lisa Gherardini were engaged in a conversation that could not be brought to a close because neither of them was willing to speak the last word. His body was declining. The paralysis in his right hand may have worsened. His general health was fragile. He drew up his will on the 23rd of April, 1519, dictating it to a notary while Melzi and others witnessed. The document is precise and practical, as one would expect from the son of a notary. He left his vineyards near Milan to Salai. He left his notebooks, his books, his instruments, and all his paintings to Melzi. He specified the arrangements for his funeral with a characteristic attention to detail. He wanted 60 poor men to carry torches at his burial, each to be paid for their service. The spring of 1519 came softly to the Loire Valley. The apple trees in the garden of Clos Lucé burst into blossom, filling the air with their pale, sweet scent. The birds returned, swallows cutting through the morning air with their sharp, curved wings, their flight as swift and precise as anything Leonardo had drawn in his Codex of Wings. The river below the hill caught the light and broke it into 1,000 moving fragments, as rivers had always done, as they would always do. Leonardo lay in his bed, in the room overlooking the garden. The canopy was drawn back to let in the light. Through the window, he could see the sky, that pale, soft, endlessly variable French sky that was so different from the deep, saturated blue of Tuscany, but that was, in its own way, just as beautiful. The sounds of the house were gentle, a fire crackling in the hearth, the murmur of voices in the next room, the distant song of a bird in the garden. He was still thinking. He was still observing. The mind that had watched a kite descend to its cradle 67 years ago, that had spent entire afternoons studying the way water curled around a stone, that had looked into the hidden chambers of the human heart by candlelight and seen the vortices that no one else would see for 400 years. That mind was still awake, still curious, still reaching toward understanding. But the body that housed it was ready to rest, and the garden outside the window, with its blossoming trees and its birdsong and its soft slanting light, seemed to say that rest, when it came, would be gentle. The echo of a bell. On the 2nd of May, 1519, Leonardo da Vinci died at Clos Lucé. He was 67 years old. The legend, perhaps the most famous of all the legends that surround his life, holds that King Francis I was at his bedside, cradling Leonardo's head in his arms as he drew his last breath. Giorgio Vasari, writing decades later, described the scene with the kind of vivid, emotional detail that has made it one of the most painted death scenes in Western art. The dying master, the weeping king, the solemn hush of a room in which genius was departing the world. It is a beautiful image, and it is almost certainly not true, or at least not literally true. Court records suggest that Francis may have been at his chateau in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, some distance from Amboise, on the day of Leonardo's death. But whether the story is fact or embellishment, it captures something real. The deep affection that existed between the young king and the old artist, and the sense that Leonardo's death was felt not merely as a personal loss, but as the passing of something irreplaceable from the world. The room would have been quiet. The fire in the hearth would have burned low, its embers glowing a soft orange in the grey afternoon light. The sound of breathing, that most intimate, most fundamental of human sounds, would have slowed and deepened, and finally, gently, stopped. And in the silence that followed, the world went on. The birds outside the window continued to sing. The river below the hill continued to flow. The spring light continued to shift and change on the surface of the garden, as it had the day before, as it would the day after, as it would for 500 years and more. Francesco Melzi was there. Of that, we can be certain. He was at Leonardo's side during those final days, and it was Melzi who wrote, in a letter to Leonardo's brothers, informing them of the death, words that rank among the most moving tributes ever paid by a student to a teacher. It would be impossible for me to express the anguish that I have suffered from this death, and while my body holds together, I shall live in perpetual unhappiness. It is the grief of everyone, for it is not in the power of nature to reproduce such another man. The grief of everyone. It is a phrase that echoes across the centuries, carrying with it the weight of a loss that Melzi could feel in his bones, but could not fully articulate. Leonardo was not merely a great artist, or a great thinker, or a great engineer. He was all of these things at once, woven together into a single unified intelligence that saw the world as no one before him had seen it, and that left behind a body of work so vast, so varied, and so far ahead of its time that 5 centuries have not been enough to fully comprehend it. Leonardo was buried, according to his wishes, in the cloister of the Church of Saint-Florentin, within the grounds of the Château d'Amboise. He was laid to rest in French soil, far from the Tuscan hills where he was born, in a small church that served the royal household. It was a modest resting place for a man of his stature, but modesty in the end suited him. He had never sought grandeur for its own sake. He had sought understanding. And understanding, unlike grandeur, does not require a monument. The Church of Saint-Florentin did not survive. It fell into disrepair during the centuries following Leonardo's death and was eventually demolished in 1808, during the upheavals of the Napoleonic era. The bones within its walls were scattered, and for decades, the precise location of Leonardo's remains was unknown. In 1863, a search was conducted among the debris of the demolished church, and a set of bones was identified, tentatively, based on the size of the skull and the presence of a stone inscription nearby, as Leonardo's. These remains were reinterred in 1874 in the chapel of Saint-Hubert, a tiny, exquisite Gothic chapel that stands within the grounds of the Château d'Amboise, its delicate stone tracery and carved lintel a jewel of late medieval architecture. If you visit that chapel today, and it is a journey worth making, if such things call to you, you will find a small, cool, quiet space. The stone floor is worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. The light enters through narrow windows and falls in soft-colored shafts across the interior. A simple stone slab on the floor marks the place where Leonardo's remains are said to rest, and on it is inscribed his name and the dates that bracket his extraordinary life, 1452 to 1519. There is no elaborate monument, no grand statue, no heroic inscription, just a name, 2 dates, and the silence of a chapel that has stood for more than 500 years, watching the river below and the sky above with the same patient attention that Leonardo himself once brought to everything he saw. The legacy he left behind is almost impossible to summarize because it refuses to fit into any single category. He completed fewer than 25 paintings in his entire life, a tiny output by the standards of his contemporaries. And yet those paintings include some of the most celebrated and most studied works in the history of art. The Mona Lisa, which he carried with him to France, and which passed after his death into the collection of the French kings, hangs today in the Louvre in Paris, behind its wall of bulletproof glass, gazed upon by millions of visitors each year who come to see the smile that never quite resolves, the eyes that seem to follow every viewer, the landscape that belongs to no real place and every real place at once. The Last Supper, despite centuries of deterioration and multiple restorations, still occupies its wall in the refectory of Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan, and visitors who are admitted in small groups, for timed visits of exactly 15 minutes, still stand before it in the particular silence that falls when human beings encounter something that exceeds their capacity to describe. But it is the notebooks, those thousands of pages of mirror-written text and intricate drawings, that may be Leonardo's greatest legacy. Melzi guarded them faithfully until his own death in 1570, but after that, they were dispersed. Some were sold, some were stolen, some were given away. They scattered across Europe like seeds blown from a dandelion, landing in the libraries of kings and cardinals and collectors, in the archives of museums and universities, where they germinated slowly over centuries, their ideas recognized and appreciated only as the world gradually caught up with the mind that had produced them. Today, the surviving notebooks, approximately 7,000 pages, roughly half of what Leonardo is believed to have written, are held in collections in Milan, Turin, London, Paris, Madrid, and Windsor Castle. They contain ideas that anticipated modern anatomy, modern hydraulics, modern optics, modern geology, modern aeronautics, and modern robotics. They contain observations about the natural world, about the flight of birds, the flow of water, the growth of plants, the structure of rocks, that are as accurate and as fresh today as they were 500 years ago. They contain drawings of such beauty and precision that they stand as works of art in their own right, independent of the scientific insights they illustrate. And they contain, scattered among the technical observations and the engineering diagrams and the anatomical studies, passages of a quiet, reflective beauty that reveal the inner life of a man who spent his whole existence watching, thinking, and wondering. The knowledge of all things is possible. Learning never exhausts the mind. The water you touch in a river is the last of what has passed and the first of that which comes. So, with time present. If this journey through Leonardo da Vinci's life has given you something to think about, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to know in the comments which moment in Leonardo's story resonates most with you, or what surprised you about the man behind the myth. The world changed because Leonardo lived in it, not through any single invention that was built, or any single institution that was founded, or any single theory that was published. He published nothing. He founded nothing. Most of his inventions were never built, and yet the change he wrought was profound, because what he demonstrated, through the sheer scope and depth and beauty of his inquiry, was a way of being in the world, a way of looking at everything with fresh eyes, of refusing to accept received wisdom without testing it against direct observation, of seeing the connections between things that others considered separate, of approaching the natural world not as a problem to be solved, but as a mystery to be savored. He was, in the end, not so much a painter, or a scientist, or an engineer, as he was an embodiment of a possibility. The possibility that a single human mind, given enough curiosity and enough patience and enough courage, could reach toward the totality of experience and, if not grasp it, at least touch its edges. The chapel of Saint-Hubert stands in the soft light of a Loire Valley afternoon. The river below the hill moves slowly toward the sea, carrying with it the last of what has passed and the first of that which comes. Somewhere above the garden of Clos Lucé, a bird rides a thermal current, tilting its wings with adjustments so subtle they are almost invisible. The same adjustments that a silver-haired man once sketched on rough paper with a charcoal pencil 500 years ago. The bell in the chapel tower has long since fallen silent, but its echo, if you listen closely, is still there. In the smile of a woman on a poplar panel in Paris, in the spiraling water studies in a leather-bound notebook in Windsor, in the careful, backward-flowing handwriting of a man who never stopped trying to understand the world, and who, in the trying, showed us what it means to be fully, magnificently, incurably human. Until our next journey into the past, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. May your dreams carry you gently, as a warm current carries a bird above a Tuscan hillside, effortless, unhurried, and free. Good night.